Oh, hello, and Happy New Year. Yeah, I'm just reading a newspaper. I mean, you can call it a newspaper. It almost feels like toilet paper. How thin it is. It's the Pocono Record. It's got a front section. It's got a sports section. Altogether, it's probably like 20 pages. It used to be much thicker. In a nutshell, it kind of describes where newspapers are at today. They're trying to figure out what their future is. And it certainly involves having to adapt to the web, where most people are expecting to get news, including from newspapers, for free. In places like the Pocono Record newspaper, some people are visiting their website from this county, Monroe County, every single day, and they're not even thinking of it as a newspaper. They're thinking of it as the Pocono Record. Because what really is the relevance of a word like newspaper today when most people are reading things online? Well, the answer is it's a mixed bag because there actually is a great utility, a great demand, a great use for paper newspapers today. People are still reading paper newspapers. Newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post still are making a big impact on the way that our society functions. So that's what we're taking on today. We're taking on newspapers. I do want to say I hope you're ready for a different week this week because we have a full 5 days, then we have a full 5 days next week. So we have a different pattern and rhythm to the class. It's time to ramp things up and really flex our knowledge as we make our way through these mass media technologies. Talking about the newspaper is undergoing rapid changes today. Rapid changes trying to adapt to people not really wanting to read stuff that is in hard copy form, including books. Same thing that books are suffering from, same things that magazines are suffering from. And yet, the biggest area of content for newspapers is actually news, right? Like books are not carrying news. Movies, they don't carry news, but news is the major content of newspapers. Seems obvious, but let's mention it all the same. Now let's go through some history of newspapers, find out where they came from and how they were formed in their early going. And the first one we want to talk about is the very first English-speaking newspaper. The first English-speaking newspaper named Curanto, Curanto, in Amsterdam in 1618. I don't know if you'll recall, but the Gutenberg printing press was invented in the 1400s, late 1400s, so we still have another almost 150 years before we get to the invention of English-speaking newspapers. In Amsterdam, I've been to many times, and it's just a city that is open to the world. It's a port city. It has to be. It's where people stop over on their way to other places. So English speakers are very, very common in Amsterdam. Early on, European governments, including governments surrounding contemporary newspapers of the Curanto, early European governments, they tried to control newspapers. They were afraid of them. They were afraid that newspapers would break up the royalty that had a stranglehold on governments. They weren't really called governments, they were called monarchies. But countries were ruled by monarchies, they were ruled by priests. So early on, governments were very, very wary of newspapers, and they would license newspapers. You had to have a license, just like you need a license to drive a car, you need to have a license to have a newspaper, and that was a way of a government controlling the content in newspapers. Now let's go across the Atlantic to the colonies, our country, the colonies, and the very first newspaper in the United States is Public Occurrences. Public Occurrences. I do have links in my email today for both of these newspapers. Publick, Public Occurrences, in 1690. And the government, our New England governments, shut down that newspaper because it was making disparaging remarks about the King of France. Imagine that, trying to shut down a newspaper for criticizing the King of France. Now we're going to introduce a name that you know pretty well, James Franklin. Not Ben Franklin, but his brother, James Franklin. He published the New England Courant in 1721, the New England Courant, Courant, and the reason that he's being mentioned here today is because he was thrown in jail. He was thrown in jail for irritating the authorities, for criticizing New England governments. He was put in jail. Who took over the newspaper? Ben Franklin, his brother, at the age of 16. Ben Franklin had a newspaper at the age of 16, the New England Current. And then he used that knowledge and experience to go on to publish the Pennsylvania Gazette. Pennsylvania Gazette. We've mentioned that earlier on in this class, the most influential newspaper in the colonies. Now let's move over to the penny press. We introduced them in an earlier class as well. Let's expand on what the penny press were. So newspapers to start with in the American colonies, originally they're not like they are today. The Pocono Record, this one has on this one's a few days old, but a cause for celebration, New Year's Eve, it's something everybody's doing. Pacific Islands face shortages from the pandemic fallout. That's of world interest. Newspapers were not of that kind of general interest originally. They were more refined and more technical. And a lot of the news that you would find, for example, would be shipping news, like when is the next ship coming over from the colonies, from Europe with goods on it. There were also political essays, a lot of talk of politics and what should be done in the formation of our new country. And mostly newspapers were for the wealthy elite. They were for people who could read and people who could afford newspapers. So because of that, the idea of objectivity, that newspapers should be unbiased, they should be objective, that didn't exist. Newspapers could be opinionated, and you just purchased the newspaper representing the organization that had the opinion that aligned with your opinion. And newspapers were very expensive, so people couldn't afford them. It's like the latest iPhone being available to somebody who is living in a house that's below the poverty line. It's what newspapers were like. Well, all of that changed with a publisher by the name of Benjamin Day. Benjamin Day started a tabloid newspaper. Again, tablet is a shape we're talking about here. It's like Moses' clay tablets. It's like our cell phones. It's like the magazine. And it's like the tabloid newspaper. He started the New York Sun. The New York Sun, he started in New York in 1833, and he had a motto above it, and it was the first time a motto was being used for a newspaper, and it was, "It shines for you." In other words, the sun shines for you. And you actually see that word sun as a metaphor for news used by many newspapers across the world. It's right. The idea of shining a light on events that would otherwise go undetected. That's what that metaphor is all about. So during Henry Day's time period, the steam engine as an invention comes in and gets implemented into the printing press procedure. So now you have a motorized printing press, and then the cost of newspapers comes down, and it's only 1 penny for a newspaper. So now everybody could afford newspapers, and people wanted to read. At the same time, we have a lot of immigrants coming to this country to work in our factories. Italian immigrants, German immigrants, Lithuanian immigrants, all kinds of Irish immigrants coming to this country to work in factories, and they want to learn to speak English, so they're reading penny newspapers, right? And so the penny press, they start to cover things like crime. They start to cover things like consumer goods, like what's a new good that's available, a better way of living. They start to cover general interest news, and because everybody's reading now, and therefore advertisers say, look at all these people reading. We can get to all these people now. Advertising jumps into the mix and infuses newspapers with revenue, classified advertisements, and also ads, 2 by 2 inches ad in the newspaper, or a full page ad, Macy's or Goodyear tires or whatever. That's what starts to happen. Okay, so now we're going to enter what we're going to call the yellow journalism era. I'll explain what that's all about. It has to do with 2 people, 2 competitors, 2 publishers. One of them was Joseph Pulitzer, Pulizer. And if that name rings a bell for you, it should, hopefully, because of the Pulitzer Prize. More about that in a moment. So Joseph Pulitzer was from Austria. He was from Austria, and he came to the U.S. to fight in the Civil War. Yeah, he came to our country as a mercenary. And actually he ended up becoming a reporter for a German newspaper. So he covered the Civil War, sending that news back to a German newspaper. And then after the Civil War, he bought a newspaper called the St. Louis Post and Dispatch. Joseph Pulitzer bought that St. Louis Post and Dispatch in 1878, and he grew that circulation. He blew it up. He blew it up from 15,000 people to 250,000 people. That's how much he grew that circulation. So he's feeling very confident, right? So he decides he wants a bigger market. So he looks at New York, and in 1883, he purchases the New York World, another tabloid. I've got all these papers today and the links in the email, so please consult them. He buys the New York World and he turned it around. What he did was he made the newspaper more dramatic. He put big headlines on the New York World. He had more photos. He had more dramatic stories. And he also invented what we call the above-the-fold concept. The above-the-fold concept is the idea that the most important story is above the fold, because people have to do a number of actions with this kind of newspaper. It's called a broadsheet newspaper. It's not a tabloid. You open it this way, and you open it this way, and it spreads out, right? So the above-the-fold concept is what Joseph Pulitzer started. And he made his paper appeal to immigrants who didn't have a lot of adeptness with the English language. He made his newspaper easy to understand because it was full of pictures, and he brought the language down, right? That's why we say today newspapers are written at a 5th grade reading level. It's so that everybody, it's kind of coming from Joseph Pulitzer's initiatives here. He also, by the way, gave women readers a reason to read newspapers. He printed romance and fiction, ideas that are stereotypical for women, but nonetheless, they were successful during that time period. So he was the first person to go after women. And advertisers realized, hey, we want our newspapers to be read by women because guess what? Women in the American household usually control how money is spent. So if we can get to women, then we can get them to purchase our products. Joseph Pulitzer also hired a famous journalist. You can see the link to her, a famous stunt journalist, actually. Her name was Nellie Bly. Nellie Bly, have you heard of Nellie Bly? She would pull stunts so that she could reveal things that were going on behind the scenes. Her most famous stunt was she got herself committed to an insane asylum. And once inside this insane asylum, she documented the abuses that were taken place, I should say. All right, next up, I mentioned Joseph Pulitzer being in competition with another person. Let's introduce this other person now. His name is William Randolph Hearst, Hearst. And William Randolph Hearst was a person coming from a wealthy family in San Francisco. And he basically got to be the editor of the San Francisco Examiner. But then he also looked at New York and said, this is a big market. So he too purchased a newspaper in New York City called the New York Journal. He purchased the New York Journal, and immediately he started a competition with Joseph Pulitzer. They were battling each other out for readers. And the style of journalism that they both fell into was known as yellow journalism, which is sensational journalism. But the name yellow journalism comes not from the color of a newspaper, but from a cartoon that used to run in one of the newspapers called The Yellow Kid. And so that Yellow Kid cartoon became emblematic of the whole style of journalism, also known as sensational journalism. It's all about big photos and about hyping up things. William Randolph Hearst was famous for covering the Spanish-American War between the United States and Spain. And a lot of that war took place in the Caribbean. And there's this famous story where one of his reporters called him up and he said, Mr. Hearst, there's nothing going on out here. I've been sitting here in this boat for days. And Hearst said to us, you furnish us the photos and we'll furnish you with the war. Now, how about that? He can create a whole war. The drama of a war, ships battling each other, even though nothing's happening. That's the power of the newspaper. Now, Joseph Pulitzer would go on to regret the style of journalism that he perpetuated. He felt that it was unsavory, that it lowered people's education, that it caused people to be cynical and afraid of their environment. And so he sort of repented. That's a religious term. I don't really use that, but he sort of said, he was remorseful. That's a word. He was remorseful, and he therefore started the School of Journalism at Columbia University in New York City, the best school for journalism at a master's level, as well as Pulitzer Prizes. If you have a Pulitzer Prize today, it's the highest prize that you can get as a journalist. Pulitzer Prize for feature writing, Pulitzer Prize for hard news, etc. You can look at the link to see a list. So now let's go on to the concept of a tabloid newspaper. in its proper form. The tabloid newspaper really became a term that was used in the 1920s. The 1920s coinciding with jazz. Jazz was was the popular form of music in the 1920s in the United States. So tabloid journalism is also known as jazz journalism. And you will see that today in any tabloid in any big city that you go to. You even see it in the Inquirer, one of those quasi-magazine newspapers at CVS when you check out. Basically, it's about big photos, huge headlines, sensational stories. All right, now the book chapter takes a hard right all of a sudden into discussing broadcast news. And it's kind of clumsy discussing broadcast news in the newspaper section, but the book chooses to do that to make sure that you know that the newspapers were not existing by themselves. Actually, a whole industry started growing up alongside of them and competing with news. And you can read about that. It started with radio stations in the 1920s right here in Pennsylvania. We're going to cover radio in its own form in a future chapter. But radio stations started to grow up, and they were actually owned by newspapers. And newspapers actually were afraid that radio stations were going to steal their audiences. So newspapers actually put restrictions on their own radio stations for delivering news. And this was all done in the famous Biltmore Agreement, done in the New York City hotel, the Biltmore, where they reached us. No, you radio stations, you can't do this. Radio stations just said, the hell with that. We're going to form our own news teams. That's what CBS did, formed its own news team. So broadcast starts to grow up very, very strongly. And then television comes on the scene after radio. And now you have all kinds of famous events that you can read about in the chapter that's forcing newspapers already to compete with another medium for news. So let's look at the newspaper business today. We can say that in the newspaper business today, it's a highly competitive environment and that profit has been falling for years. The biggest cash cow for newspapers used to be that classified section. I don't even know if you know about that today because it's all handled on Craigslist and other websites. But the classified section, people are advertising garage sales and obituaries, that shrunk. So newspapers today are struggling. Now let's look at some of the national newspapers and what they are known for. We've got the Wall Street Journal. We've mentioned that before. That's a news corporation. Remember that company? That's a property of the News Corporation. It's known as a conservative newspaper and also the financial newspaper because it's named after Wall Street, where all the stockbrokers are in New York City. Then we've got USA Today. USA Today is known as kind of like a television newspaper. It even looks like a TV. It's very colorful, has big pictures, sports. Still a very strong newspaper. It's distributed for free in hotels usually. That's how they try to get to business travelers and rely on advertising to carry the funding. So we also have the New York Times. The New York Times is the most prestigious newspaper in the United States. If the New York Times runs a story, then many other newspapers are going to be commenting on what the New York Times is saying. It's also known as a liberal newspaper. And it has politically, and it has a slogan that says that it's all the news that's fit to print. All the news that's fit to print. If it's not the New York Times, it's not news. We've also got the Washington Post. The Washington Post is a liberal newspaper. It's politically liberal. It's in Washington, D.C. It's also known as an investigative newspaper. It was, after all, the newspaper that brought down the presidency of Richard Nixon through investigating the Watergate scandal. Then we've got the Los Angeles Times. The Los Angeles Times is known as a newspaper that has won a lot of Pulitzer Prizes by including quotes from women and minorities. And there's a term that they used for this called mainstreaming, is to try to bring women and minorities, particularly Hispanics, where there's a lot of Hispanics in Los Angeles, into mainstream news. All right, now we're going to talk about patriotism and the press. There is a danger if you're a journalist. You can look at the link to see which countries are the most dangerous to be a journalist in. Some reporters have been held hostage. Some have been decapitated. Some have been threatened. I once interviewed a Mexican journalist for my book, and the Mexican journalist said he was writing a story that was critical of the government, and he got a phone call that said, "Hey, we understand that your daughter is getting her driver's license test tomorrow." Click. And that's all it took. That's the kind of thing that goes on. All right, let's move in now to the alternative press. The alternative press is a press that is advancing the cause of groups that are disenfranchised, groups on the wrong side or the other side of social justice, groups that are in the minority interest, and so they are advancing those interests. And the first one was the Freedom Journal. The Freedom Journal in 1827. Freedom Journal in 1827 is founded by John Russwurm, Russwurm, John Russwurm. He's the first black person to get a college degree, and he started this paper because prior to this newspaper, the only way that blacks existed in newspapers was as criminals. That's when they were newspapers. They were covered as criminals. Sound familiar? That's why that show Cops by Fox was finally taken off of the air. Same thing, showing black people as criminals, overwhelmingly as as criminals. Well, the Freedom Journal tried to change that around and show black people achieving things, achieving things. All right, another newspaper that had a similar kind of effort was the North Star. The North Star newspaper in 1847, and that was published by Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is a person who was a slave, who has gained his freedom, and with his freedom he chose to become an orator, to go around the country and to deliver speeches that would try to impact society to make changes. Instead of taking violence, instead of being bitter, he was a man who had great expanse of his mind. And so many universities actually have what's known as a Frederick Douglass Scholar in Residence. That's to encourage African Americans to come work for a university to continue to advance civil rights issues. And we have one here at East Stroudsburg University. Her name is Dr. Victoria Thomas. Dr. Victoria Thomas, if you're interested, she's teaching a dynamite class in the spring. It's called Social Justice Communication. Jake's in that class. Social Justice Communication, CMST 290, if you're interested. At any rate, Frederick Douglass had the North Star newspaper, and that's what that North Star was all about. Specifically, it was focusing on emancipation. Emancipation is 1847, freeing African Americans. Another newspaper similarly was the Chicago Defender. Chicago Defender later on in 1905. This newspaper happened to exist during the yellow journalism time period. So it also had sensationalism qualities to it, including red headlines. You can look at it. And this was the editor for this news. You can look at it in the link that I sent out. The newspaper for this was Robert Abbott. He was the editor. All right, next up we have Spanish language newspapers. And particularly we have El Nuevo Herald. That's the New World with my rough Spanish accent. And it's a companion to the Miami Herald, which is an English-speaking newspaper. So that newspaper is thoroughly read across the country by Hispanic populations. We also have a gay press. The gay press was started by the Washington Blade in Washington, D.C. And once again, gay people did not have representation in newspapers, so this newspaper started to help move gay culture into the mainstream. You can still find the Blade online today. And then there's just a bunch of underground newspapers in general. If you get on a subway in New York City, you might get a hard copy of the Metro newspaper. It's a free newspaper, the Village Voice, the Chicago Reader. They carry things like phone sex, personals, alternative political opinions. So now that brings us to the future of newspapers. What is the future? Well, we, as always, have to take a guess about that. We do know that advertising dollars for the print version of newspapers have been declining, and that newspapers are still struggling to find a way to monetize their content, to make money off of the content that they are putting onto their websites. They're doing that through ads, through click-throughs. If you try to go onto the Pocono Record, you can read 3 stories, and then that's it. You have to subscribe after that to the Pocono Record if you want to get a news story. So we know that newspapers are moving to the web, and whether the concept of a newspaper will even be something that continues to exist, or whether you'll just simply know them as news organizations like the New York Times. So there's some information on newspapers. If you've never read a newspaper before, I hope you at least do before you finish out your lifetime at least once. In the meantime, have a great day.